Old farmhouse growers had a rule for brand new strawberry plants that sounds almost cruel by modern standards. Every single flower had to be destroyed before it could ever become fruit, and growers who broke that rule were warned their plants would never fully recover. Most gardeners today do the exact opposite without knowing it. What the old growers called paying the first fruit turns out to be the single reason their strawberry beds produced more berries than most modern gardens ever will. You are about to get the exact old technique and the modern method built on it, the farmhouse tradition of paying the first fruit that makes this feel like more than a garden hack, and the specific plant energy science, variety adjustments, and zone timing most gardeners have never been taught as a complete system. And by the end, you will hear the one question about this old tradition that gardeners have quietly debated for generations. One this video will not fully settle. The first-year sacrifice became a farmhouse staple technique for one simple, hard reason. A strawberry plant allowed to fruit in its first season permanently caps its own long-term productivity because it spends its limited early energy on fruit instead of on the roots and runners that would have produced far more fruit in every season after. Farmhouse almanacs, homestead journals, and early agricultural extension writing documented this exact trade-off across generations of American strawberry growing, using a specific vocabulary, starving the plant, paying the first fruit, language that framed a real energy allocation principle in the words of sacrifice and ritual. Modern gardeners get disappointing harvests today for a much simpler reason than bad luck or bad soil. Most advice online skips this first-year step entirely, focusing only on watering and sunlight, and misses the one decision that actually determines whether a strawberry bed ever becomes what it is capable of becoming. Everything else in this video, the runners, the renovation, the feeding, the mulch, the pollination window, the winter protection, builds directly on top of that first decision. Skip it, and the rest of the system works against a plant that was never given the chance to grow strong enough to use it. Step number 1. Paying the first fruit. Old farmhouse accounts describe growers walking their new strawberry rows every few days in the first season, pinching off every flower before it could ever become fruit. Some accounts go further than that, describing this as a debt the plant had to pay before it was allowed to give anything back, a price extracted before the reward was permitted. Here is what was actually happening beneath that language. A young strawberry plant has a limited energy budget in its first year. Every flower allowed to develop into fruit is energy diverted directly away from establishing the root system and sending out the runners that will produce far more fruit in every future season. A plant that fruits in year 1 is measurably smaller and less productive for every year afterward, a trade-off old growers observed empirically long before anyone understood plant energy allocation as a science. The technique is simple, and it requires more discipline than skill. Walk your strawberry bed every few days during the entire first growing season and pinch off every single bloom at the stem the moment it appears, before it has any chance to become fruit. This is harder in practice than it sounds. A first-year strawberry plant in good soil will keep producing new blooms all season long, and each one will look exactly as healthy and promising as the last. The discipline is not in the pinching itself, which takes seconds. The discipline is in doing it again and again, week after week, while the plant keeps offering you something that looks worth keeping. The fatal mistake is letting even a few first-year berries ripen out of reluctance to waste a healthy-looking bloom. That reluctance is completely understandable, and it is also the exact instinct that keeps a strawberry patch small for years. It is worth naming clearly, because almost every disappointed strawberry grower shares this exact same starting mistake, made with the best of intentions. June-bearing varieties benefit most dramatically from full first-year blossom removal, since their entire yield potential depends on how strong the plant becomes before its single big fruiting season arrives. Everbearing and day-neutral varieties can be allowed a small mid to late summer fruit set in year 1 without the same steep yield penalty, since their genetics already divide energy differently across the season. Old accounts insist this pinching had to happen before the flower fully opened, not after, a detail some records treat as more important than the pinching itself. Nothing in current plant science explains why the exact moment of the bloom matters more than simply removing it before it sets fruit. A flower pinched a day after opening loses the same energy investment as one pinched before opening, at least by every measure researchers have tried. That detail is still coming. Step number 2. Reading the runners. Old growers decided which runners to keep and which to cut largely by feel, and some regional accounts describe this decision in oddly personal terms, choosing which of the mother plant's children were allowed to stay and which had to be cut away entirely. The real explanation is a limit on how much a single plant can actually support. Each strawberry plant can only sustain a limited number of daughter plants before all of them, mother included, become weaker and progressively less productive. Unlimited rooting turns a strawberry bed into a crowded, competing mat rather than a set of strong, independent plants. The technique is to allow 3 to 4 strong runners per mother plant and cut every additional runner at the connecting stem before it has a chance to root and draw further energy. Use a clean pair of garden snips and cut close to the mother plant rather than leaving a long stub. The fatal mistake is letting every runner root freely, which produces a strawberry bed that looks lush and full within 2 seasons, while actually yielding less fruit per square foot than a properly thinned one. Day-neutral varieties produce fewer runners naturally and need less thinning overall. June-bearing varieties in warmer growing zones produce runners aggressively and need the most consistent, repeated management through the entire growing season. A useful way to think about this step is to picture the mother plant's total energy as a fixed amount, no larger this year than it was last year. Every runner she is allowed to feed splits that fixed amount a little further. 4 strong daughters sharing that energy produce 4 strong plants next season. 12 weak daughters, sharing the same fixed amount, produce 12 mediocre ones, and often weaken the mother plant in the process too. The runner thinning explains the family-sized limits of a mother plant completely. It does not explain why old accounts insisted the cutting had to happen at dusk, a detail that has nothing to do with plant biology at all, since a runner severed at noon disconnects from its mother plant exactly the same way one severed at sundown does. That detail is still coming, and the pattern connecting it to step number 1 is starting to take shape. Drop a comment right now and tell me which type of strawberry you are growing, June-bearing, ever-bearing, or day-neutral, and how big your harvest has been so far. I read every comment, and I want to know what you are working with before we go further into the technique. Step number 3. The post-harvest renovation. Old farmhouse practice called for cutting strawberry foliage back hard the moment the harvest ended, and some accounts describe this in language that goes beyond ordinary garden maintenance, forcing the bed to start over before it was permitted to rest at all. The real explanation is disease control combined with energy redirection. Removing old, disease-prone foliage right after fruiting stimulates fresh, healthy leaf growth and redirects the plant's energy toward next year's flower bud formation instead of maintaining leaves that are already spent for the season. The technique applies specifically to June-bearing plants. Mow or cut them down to about 1 inch above the crown within a week or 2 of the last harvest, then fertilize and water to support fresh regrowth. The fatal mistake is skipping renovation entirely, leaving old foliage in place through the rest of summer, which invites fungal disease and leaves the plant with less energy available for next year's flower buds. Ever-bearing and day-neutral varieties should never be renovated this way, since they are still actively fruiting through the season. This step would otherwise interrupt. Gardeners in colder zones must complete June-bearing renovation early enough that the plant can rebuild its foliage before the first fall frost arrives. It helps to remember that renovation looks brutal in the moment. A healthy-looking bed of green leaves cut down to bare crowns within an hour can feel like undoing an entire season of work. It is the opposite. The plant does not need last year's leaves anymore. It needs the energy those leaves were quietly consuming, redirected toward the flower buds that will become next year's harvest. If you have ever picked a small, disappointing handful of berries off a bed that looked completely healthy all season, this is usually where the real problem started, not with the picking, but with what happened, or did not happen, right after the last berry came off the plant the year before. Step number 4. The feeding switch. Old accounts describe growers changing what they fed strawberry plants partway through the season, and the language used to describe this change is oddly specific, switching what the plant was given the moment it stopped growing and started giving. The real explanation is a straightforward nutrient trade-off. Nitrogen-heavy fertilizer promotes leaf growth at the direct expense of fruiting. while a feed higher in phosphorus and potassium supports strong root development and flower bud formation instead. The technique is to use a balanced or nitrogen-light fertilizer during early spring growth, then switch to a phosphorus and potassium-focused feed as flowering approaches, and again after renovation to rebuild the plant for next season. The fatal mistake is using the same all-purpose, high-nitrogen fertilizer all season long, which produces lush, dark green plants and a strangely disappointing amount of fruit underneath all that leaf growth. Everbearing and day-neutral varieties need this feeding switch repeated multiple times through the season, since they are fruiting continuously rather than once. June-bearing varieties need it timed carefully around their single main fruiting period instead. Most gardeners who struggle with this step are not doing anything wrong exactly. They are simply doing the same right thing at the wrong time, applying a feed built for leaf growth during the exact weeks the plant needed a feed built for fruit. The fertilizer itself was never the problem. The timing was. Has anyone watching already tried removing first-year blooms before this video? Tell me in the comments what happened to your harvest the following year. The comment section on these videos is one of the most useful places to find real gardener experience with this exact method. If you have still been watching and Garden Every Day is not yet in your subscription list, understand what that actually means. YouTube tracks the channels you follow and prioritizes your content in your feed. The moment you leave this video without subscribing, the algorithm begins deciding whether to show you the next one, and it does not always decide in your favor. Complete growing systems like this one go out from this channel every single week. Hit subscribe. It will not take you nearly as long as it took you to read that sentence. Step number 5. The mulch ritual. Old tradition called for mulching strawberry beds specifically with straw, the very material some accounts claim the plant's common name quietly references, and old growing records describe an unusual insistence on exactly when that straw could go down, never a day sooner than growers judged correct. The real explanation is simple protection. Straw mulch keeps developing berries off damp soil, preventing rot and fungal disease from the ground up, while also regulating soil temperature and moisture more evenly than bare, exposed soil ever could. The technique is to apply 2 to 3 inches of straw mulch around the plants once flowering begins, not earlier and not later, once the flowers have opened and fruit set is underway. The fatal mistake is mulching too early and smothering new spring growth before it has a chance to establish, or skipping mulch entirely and losing a meaningful portion of the harvest to soil contact rot on the underside of the fruit. Gardeners in wetter climates and heavier clay soils need mulch most urgently, regardless of which variety they are growing. Gardeners in naturally drier zones can use a somewhat lighter mulch layer without losing the benefit. Straw is not simply a passive barrier here. It reflects light back up under the leaves slightly, and it moderates soil temperature swings enough to reduce stress on developing fruit during a sudden hot stretch. A bed without mulch is not just risking rot. It is asking the plant to cope with conditions a properly mulched bed never has to deal with at all. That disappointing handful of berries at the end of a full growing season is rarely bad luck. It is almost always a misstep earlier in the process, a bloom that should have been pinched, a feed that should have been switched, a mulch that went down too late, or never went down at all. Every step in this video exists specifically to remove one of those missteps at a time. Step number 6. The pollination window. Old growers paid unusual attention to the specific short window when strawberry flowers were open and receptive, and some accounts describe this window in almost sensory terms, the hours the plant was listening for something to arrive. The real explanation is time-sensitive biology. Strawberry flowers are only receptive to pollination for a limited number of days, and incomplete pollination produces small, misshapen, lopsided berries instead of full, well-formed fruit. The technique is to encourage pollinator activity specifically during the bloom window, through nearby companion flowers that attract bees, or gentle hand pollination with a soft brush for isolated or indoor-grown plants that pollinators rarely visit. A few strokes across the open center of each flower is enough to make a real difference. The fatal mistake is using pesticides during the bloom window, which reduces pollinator visits at the exact moment the plant depends on them most, and directly shrinks the size and shape of the resulting harvest. Everbearing and day-neutral varieties need this attention repeated across multiple bloom windows through the whole season. June-bearing varieties have one single critical window that effectively determines the entire year's harvest in one pass. This is also where a heavy-handed pest control approach quietly undermines everything the first 6 steps built. A grower who sprayed broadly at the first sign of any insect, without regard for the bloom window, can do more damage to the eventual harvest than the pest they were trying to stop ever would have. The feeding switch gives you the real reason lush green strawberry plants can still produce almost no fruit. But it does not explain why some old accounts describe growers who never changed their feed at all, using the exact same soil amendment every single year on the same ground, and somehow still produce the largest harvests in the county. The next step gets closer to that answer, or closer to why the answer is not quite as complete as it sounds. Which of these 7 surprised you most so far? Drop the step number in the comments. And tell me honestly, how many of you have let a brand new strawberry plant fruit in its first year because pulling the blooms off felt wasteful? No judgment, almost everyone has. But that one change is one of the simplest and most impactful things in this video. Step number 7. Preparing for the long sleep. Old farmhouse practice called for protecting strawberry crowns before the ground fully froze, described in some of the oldest surviving accounts as tucking the plant in for a season it would not be seen again until spring, language that treats dormancy less like a pause and more like a departure. The real explanation is straightforward crown protection. Strawberry crowns are vulnerable to frost heave and sudden temperature swings in winter, and a layer of protective mulch insulates the crown and root zone through repeated freeze and thaw cycles that would otherwise damage it. The technique is a loose, thick winter mulch layer. Straw or pine needles work well, applied directly over the plants once the ground has partially frozen, not before that point. The fatal mistake is mulching too early, while the ground is still warm, which traps excess moisture against the crown and encourages rot before winter cold ever becomes the real threat. Gardeners in Zone 5 and colder need this protection applied without exception every single year, regardless of how mild a particular winter looks likely to be. Gardeners in Zone 8 and warmer often need little to no winter mulch at all, since crown exposure rarely reaches damaging levels there. An unprotected crown does not necessarily die from a single cold night. It is the repeated cycle, frozen, thawed, frozen again, that gradually damages the tissue holding next spring's growth. A mulch layer put down at the right moment does not fight the cold directly. It simply slows the swing enough for the crown to ride it out intact. Before the resolution, here is the full season feeding calendar, worth pausing to write down. Early spring growth gets a balanced or nitrogen-light feed. As flowering approaches, switch to a phosphorus and potassium-focused feed to support fruit and bud development. After post-harvest renovation, feed again with that same phosphorus and potassium focus to rebuild the plant for next season. And for winter mulch by zone, Zones 5 and colder need full winter mulch without exception. Zones 6 and 7 benefit from a lighter protective layer, and Zones 8 and warmer generally need little to none. Modern horticultural science explains most of what old farmhouse tradition described as paying the first fruit, starving the plant, and tucking the crown in for winter. The plant energy allocation principle, the renovation cycle, and the crown insulation mechanism are all explicable through contemporary agricultural science. None of that part is a mystery anymore. Here is what still is not explained. Multiple independent old farmhouse traditions, in different regions, with no documented contact between them, specifically insisted the first blossom removal had to happen before a certain phase of the moon, and that runner cutting was best done at dusk rather than during daylight hours. Neither timing changes the plant's actual energy allocation. Neither timing changes root development in any way researchers have ever measured. A bloom pinched under a full moon disappears exactly as completely as one pinched under a new moon, and a runner cut at noon disconnects from its mother plant the same way one cut at dusk does. Some agricultural historians believe these details were simply memory aids, a way to make sure a demanding, easy-to-skip technique actually got followed consistently, in an era before written instructions were common in most households. A rule tied to the moon is hard to forget and hard to argue your way out of. A rule that simply says remove every bloom for an entire season is much easier to quietly abandon halfway through, especially once the first tempting berry appears. Others point out that this same specific pairing, moon timing for the blossoms, dusk timing for the runners, appears again and again across farming communities that never shared records or spoke to one another, which is harder to fully dismiss as coincidence alone. No agronomic mechanism yet identified explains why two unconnected traditions would land on the same specific pairing if convenience alone were the whole explanation. So here is where this actually leaves us. The strawberry harvest you grow this year and next comes down almost entirely to the science in this video: energy allocation, renovation, feeding, pollination, and protection. And it comes wrapped in a specific set of timing details that farmers insisted on for generations, details that changed nothing measurable, and that nobody has ever fully explained. Two things can be true here at the same time, and this entire video has tried to hold both of them without pretending one cancels the other out. Do you believe the old strawberry sacrifice tradition, timing and all, was simply an early empirical discovery of real plant science, dressed up in ritual language to make sure it got followed correctly? Or do you believe the consistency of these specific unexplained timing details across farming communities that never spoke to one another suggests something the explanation still has not fully accounted for? Real gardeners and real agricultural historians land on both sides of this, and there is no settled answer between them. The comment section on this video stays active for months, because this is a debate gardeners genuinely find worth having. Your own results with this method, this season and next, are the most useful data point in that ongoing conversation, more useful than anything covered in this script. If this method changed how you think about your strawberry patch, hit like before you go. Subscribe to Garden Spot for a complete growing system every single week. Share this with any gardener you know who has been disappointed by a small strawberry harvest and never understood why. And check the next video for a complete small space berry garden built on this exact same energy allocation principle, applied to raspberries and blueberries. Paying the first fruit was plant energy allocation. The runner limit was resource competition. The long sleep was crown insulation. All of that is settled. Why the moon phase and the dusk timing still show up, unbroken, across farming communities that never spoke to each other, is not. Tell me what you think it means.